All right, welcome to Sci Philipod. I am your host, as always, Benjamin Weingard, in an undisclosed location in Hillsdale, Michigan, also on the third floor
I
of
thought you
Whitney
were
Estates.
I thought you were largely disclosed.
Yeah, specific apartment number is hidden for
I see.
reasons
That's
of
blacked out.
national security.
Humble co-pilot, Poline guard, former employee of a college in an undisclosed location in the Midwest, from where I broadcast.
So we will go over the week's kind of news, selecting a couple of key topics to talk about. So first, we will discuss the stimulus, debate about that, and debate about, I think, two areas of debate: the substance of the stimulus, and then the process that the Democrats are using to pass the stimulus.
Well, substance, process, politics, I guess you could say, right?
Yeah, yes, that's fair. So we'll get into that, and then we're going to discuss the internecine war among the Republican Party that's continued into this week with Elizabeth Cheney and especially Marjorie Taylor Greene. And then we will finish with the article of the week, and that is Avik Roy's Restoring the Conservative Conscience.
Right, which is germane to the civil war in the GOP.
It is. So we start with the stimulus. So just to kind of set the table on this,
Yes.
what has happened during the week. So we know that obviously Biden is putting together this American Rescue Plan. He's asking for about 1.9 trillion in spending. We'll get into the details of the spending momentarily, but just note that as of now, both the House and the Senate voted mostly along party lines to actually, the Senate was entirely among party lines, with Harris casting the tie-breaking vote to ready the package for reconciliation.
Yes, and reconciliation is this process whereby a party can pass a policy with a bare majority in the Senate. So 51 votes, 50 plus the vice president in this case, right?
That's right. And then there's it seems likely that the component of the legislation that was going to raise the minimum wage probably will get taken out. The idea that there's debate about whether you could pass a minimum wage hike through reconciliation. Biden has indicated that he doesn't think that can happen.
Yeah, he said that in an interview. So reconciliation has to have something to do, right, with the budget of the government.
Taxing and spending, not something spending to do with it. According to the Byrd rule, that taxing and spending has to be key to the legislation. Correct. Otherwise, it's just incidental. In which case, the bill dies in the so-called bird bath, where the parliamentarian objects to it.
Right. So the question about the minimum wage, you would probably be stretching reconciliation process if you tried to put the minimum wage through it.
Right.
And because I don't think Biden wants to do that. Furthermore, it's not clear that Joe Manchin from West Virginia, supported the minimum wage, and he's expressed skepticism about it. Some people thought that the minimum wage was just put in as a negotiating tactic. So the minimum wage proposal in the bill, the original bill, was $15 federal minimum wage.
Up from $7.25.
Yeah.
That's right. And because minimum wage is probably best conceptualized as like a regulatory change almost, right?
Right.
Related to labor. And so the whatever effect that it would have on taxing and spending wouldn't be incidental to the legislation there.
Correct. Right.
But
so
the rest
looks like that's going to be out. But
the rest of the bill is clearly you can pass this through reconciliation.
Yes.
The Republicans, or a group of 10 Republicans headed by Susan Collins, made a counter offer to the 1.9 trillion Democratic proposal. Before
Yes.
getting into that, I'll note, I think there are basically four kind of areas of debate here. One is on the substance of the actual bill. I'll get into, because I think the most famous critique of the bill thus far has come from Larry Summers in an op-ed in the Washington Post.
The most discussed criticism.
Yeah, and this is particularly important because Summers is a Democrat,
right,
and he's known for being a liberal economist. He also was instrumental to the Obama administration's stimulus package, and at that time argued to keep the stimulus lower than some other advisors, namely Kristen Romer and Jared Bernstein, wanted the administration to go. And then you have this critique. I think, best summary of it is from that I've heard or read was from Megan McArdle, that it's problematic because it's not targeted enough.
Correct. Yep.
Then we have the process criticism from individuals such as Yuval Levin, who doesn't like the idea of immediately going reconciliation.
Right.
And then you have the political debate, which is related to the process, but somewhat separate, of, is this good politics for the Democratic Party?
Right. So this is a $1.9 trillion proposal. So let's look at what's all in there. So you get, the proposal right now has $160 billion for a national vaccine program.
Right.
$350 billion funding for states who are likely to see budget shortfalls of somewhere around 120 to 130 billion. I saw estimates, because states have to run balanced budgets. So obviously that's,
Yeah. So as we talk about what's in the bill, let's note that the Republican proposal, the $618 billion proposal, the Republicans also have 160 in their
I thought we could look at theirs after this one.
Okay,
so here's the Democrat one.
Okay.
160 for national vaccine, 350 for states, 440 for communities, 170 for schools, 400 and something for checks.
Yep.
What else is there in there?
465 billion for direct payments.
Right.
350 billion for
states.
unemployment
for
insurance
unemployment, that's
benefits.
Right. So they want the proposal is to increase unemployment benefits $400 over what they normally would be through September of 2021. Yeah.
Yes, and then it includes 120 billion as a child tax credit.
That's right.
50 billion in relief for small businesses, 40 billion for child care, and then 35 billion for rental assistance.
Okay. So the Republican criticism, and then leading to their proposal. So the Republican criticism, and then we can get into the broader, like Larry Summers criticism, et cetera. The Republican criticism is it's too big, and a lot of the things in here aren't directly related to fighting the pandemic. So they came, 10 of the 10 senators, probably, I guess, Romney and Susan Collins most prominently, right?
Yeah, yes.
They came out with a counter proposal of $618 billion that got rid of the state funding.
Yep.
It significantly scaled back the direct checks.
Yes. And most importantly, with the direct checks, the Republicans want those to be more means tested.
Right. That is to say, if you make, say, over 75,000, you don't get $1,400. Maybe you get $600 or whatever. And
right. So more targeted at people who have been directly affected by the pandemic. The Republicans don't have any funding for the child tax credit either. And they propose spending much less on school reopening. So again, Democrats 170 billion, the Republican package had 20 billion. with none of that goes to higher education. So it was only for K through 12.
Right.
They proposed the same amount for small businesses, 50 billion, and half of the Democratic proposal for childcare, namely 20 billion compared to 40,
and then
nothing
lower for unemployment. They had
that's
it at
right.
300 and for a short extension period.
That's right. And then finally, they also lack any funding for rental assistance.
Yes.
So it's a much smaller package.
Right. That's the Republican counter proposal. Biden did meet with these senators, and Collins praised what happened and said it was cordial, but said there was no agreement there. And since that meeting, Biden has sounded much more enthusiastic about going forward with the 1.9. And although he's hinted at negotiating about the direct payment checks, right? That seems something he's willing to negotiate. And he always seemed a little reluctant on the minimum wage, which makes one think maybe that was in there as a negotiating chip.
Or maybe as a sop to the left of the Democratic caucus.
Possibly that too. But I don't think Biden's too sad that isn't going to make it, probably.
No, I don't think so either. And I think, although I would be favorable toward a higher federal minimum wage, this is an issue that activists can attempt to accomplish at the state level, as they have, because we've seen these minimum wage laws are quite popular. So if you can get one on the ballot, they usually will pass. So that might be a way to accomplish the goal. And then you could also, if you're doing it by state, you can have, like automatic adjustment for different living standards in different states.
Right.
So I think maybe Biden, they're talking about this, and it's probably the least germane part of the package.
So, right, agreed. What's interesting is that up to this point, just to put this in context, the government has already spent it passed a $1.8 trillion CARES Act. That was the first act that was passed. That's the Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Right. $1.8 trillion. And then in December, they passed a $900 billion package that many of the funds haven't even been distributed from that package.
Right.
So in the $3 billion realm for overall spending, to compare that, the Obama stimulus during the Great Recession was roughly $780 billion. So have already vastly outspent that.
Yes.
So the criticism of this bill, and then we can talk about the politics of it, but it's just a straightforward criticism of the substance. So there's the criticism of, some of this is misguided. It doesn't target the right things. But the overall criticism of the size of it, right, is it's just too big. We don't need that much. So, for example, Michael Strain estimates, and there are different estimates on that, but he estimates that the output gap for 2021, and the output gap, to be clear, what that means is you look at how much could the economy produce just given the underlying infrastructure, and how much will it produce. He estimates that gap will be about $420 billion. So if you look at this proposal, it's 1.9 trillion. That's obviously vastly more than the output gap. Then the question is, how much bang do you get for your buck? That is, how much economic activity does each dollar of government spending lead to? And there's something called the multiplier effect, which gets complicated. But the basic idea is sometimes spending $1 of government money actually leads to more than $1 in the economy. Some people estimate all the way up to $2.50 per dollar. Some people argue it's actually a negative multiplier, and you actually don't get even $1 out of it. So some go down to 50 cents per dollar. Most economists argue that you won't get a robust multiplier in the coronavirus era, because we're still shut down to some degree, social distancing, etc. So let's assume 50 cents per dollar. If that were true, you would still be doubling the estimated output gap for 2021. Mm-hmm. So that's the argument that people who think it's too big would forward. And Larry Summers, as you noted, wrote a Washington Post op-ed.
Yeah, and I think so. Summers, his numbers are slightly different from Strain's, but he estimates that there would be a $50 billion a month demand shortfall. And if the 1.9 trillion stimulus passed, that would put 150 billion a month into the economy. So it would overshoot it by a factor of 3. And he also noted that, like, currently unemployment is falling, actually.
Right.
There's a lot of pent up demand. So there's like roughly 1.5 trillion in accumulated money that got pumped into the economy that you would assume if things opened up after mass vaccination, that pent up demand will get released. And we also already have extremely loose monetary policy right now. So you put all of that together, and I think I'll just quote from Summers. So he says, there's a chance that the macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation, with consequences for the value of the dollar and financial stability.
Right.
So both Strain, who's on the right, and Summers, who's on the left, have these concerns about overheating the economy.
Yes. And one thing, and also, so Summers, I think, makes good arguments about the potential consequences for a progressive agenda, because his concern is you're going to do this and then you're going to crowd out your ability to make, say, infrastructural investments, say a year from now or whatever, months from now.
That's right.
And it's interesting because I read the Summers article as less of a criticism. I mean, it's like, yeah, it might overshoot it. It doesn't say he knows for sure. It's a cautious piece, right? It's like, I applaud the goal here.
Yep.
It seems to me the real worry that Summers has isn't about the potential macroeconomic effects, because he thinks you can handle those via monetary policy, right?
Yeah, although he takes a jab at the Fed that I thought was unfair.
Right, but really his concern is more that it would interfere with a potential Biden agenda down the road.
Yeah, and I think I think the best argument there is if we're going to do this progressive agenda, it's going to entail spending on infrastructure. And infrastructure spending is extremely important because you can think of that as an investment in the future.
Right.
You spend money on infrastructure, you get some dollars back for that. It makes the economy more efficient. This spending here, while some of it is necessary, it's not an investment in the economy. It's just putting money out to states, localities, to individuals. It's not building in our future.
Right. So spending, you need some of it. And I think Summers would agree with that. But so here are the two things I think you can really criticize. The checks you can criticize because here's some data on the check. So the last round of checks that went out, households above $78,000 saved $555 out of $600. So they spent $45. That's not a lot of stimulus there. Mostly what happened is people, especially above a certain threshold, saved it. So it's weird that you would send a $1,400 check to somebody making $75,000 a year who didn't lose their job. Right. I mean, that's not really the person we should be so worried about, and probably targeting that a little bit more would be wise. Well, the other thing you can criticize, and then you can comment on that, is the unemployment, the length of the extension and the amount that you're giving people. So normally on unemployment, people make about 30 to 50% of what they made when they were employed, which is, of course, what we want, because we want people to be motivated to find another job. Now, in March, when the coronavirus struck and when we passed the first aid, we wanted to make it 100% of their pay, which seems perfectly reasonable because they weren't going back to work regardless of motive.
Right.
Now, though, it's not clear that you want to do that in, say, March, April, May, and this proposal extends it through September. So, for example, with the $400 addition to the unemployment per month, 60% of workers would be making more on unemployment than they would working. So right. That's basically a disemployment incentive structure. And It's not clear that I understand that you want it if the option is you're risking your life to go to work. But when we're in June and July, it's not clear that we're going to want that. And that's why I think an argument that why not just do it for a smaller period of time and see what the world looks like in June or July is reasonable.
Yeah. And so the lack of appropriate targeting, that's also Megan McArdle's critique on Left, Right, and Center. So she makes the claim that if you look overall, basically with the exception of leisure and hospitality, we're at full employment, but that sector has gotten obliterated, and they need targeted help there. Sending $1,400 out doesn't hit specifically that group of people. So a lot of it, as you mentioned, is going to end up being saved, and it's going to households that don't need it. Now, I don't,
and that's a lot of money. By the way,
it's a lot. Yes,
it's a lot.
I think McArdle's not that's wrong, though. It is true that the leisure and hospitality has the highest unemployment compared to last year. So if you look at it, it's still around 16% unemployment. However, there's been a loss of over 1 million jobs in state, local, and federal government. You look at manufacturing, education, and health services. The unemployment rate in almost every sector is higher than it was a year ago.
And
so I don't buy that argument.
I don't think that's exactly right. But the state spending, which the bill proposes, I think 350 billion. We need some of that because there's higher unemployment with state jobs. So like 150 billion to me seems reasonable from what I can glean. I actually found Summers, and then I a couple more technical articles that were much longer than Summers, obviously just writing an op-ed. But I think Summers' worries are quite legitimate, and I think people should take them more seriously around Biden. And you can see that people around Biden have been very dismissive, in fact, almost hostile to Summers, right? Which is weird because I think Summers is legitimately more interested in infrastructure spending and some of these more progressive ideas down the road. And that's what he's really concerned about. And I don't think he doesn't want Biden to squander that, the ability to do some kind of program like that by passing something now that isn't actually, when you really look into the details here, it's not that progressive in some sense, because you're giving a lot of the money is being spent for people who are making a lot of money or who aren't really being hurt by the pandemic.
I agree with that. Now, the counterpoint, one that comes just from Biden himself, is, well, what we've learned, right, in the past is you can't really go too big, but you can go too small. And if you go too small on the stimulus, you sputter. And then you also have Jerome Powell, who's repeatedly stated that he's more concerned about falling short of a complete recovery than he is of overshooting it. And as he said, frankly, we'd welcome slightly higher levels of inflation. That would probably be a good thing overall.
Right. But that concern is somewhat orthogonal to the concerns about how this is targeted and what it's going to do. I mean, I would like to see more government expenditure on certain things, but I don't want it to be on $1,400 checks for people who are making, for households who are making $75,000.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
It's a waste. It's
Well,
not
I think
necessary.
that's where taking some of the criticisms of the 10 Republicans seriously would serve the Biden administration well, and you
Right.
could modulate the targeting there, make it more
Right.
means tested. I think that's a good idea, because I share that concern. Now, when you're looking at the funding for state and local governments, I think the Biden administration is correct that we need to get that out, because they are going to be struggling. And then what happens? They cut services and then lay people off.
Agreed. So the question there is just about size. I think actually pretty much everyone agrees that it's a good idea to get some money there. The question is how much. Strain estimates you need about 100 billion. Obviously, that's a lot less than what's in the proposal.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well, also, I just think maybe, okay, so if you can do 2 reconciliations this year, so they go through this process. Let's say that you do overshoot slightly, so that when we get everybody vaccinated, or at least enough people to hit herd immunity, things start opening up, people start spending their money, and the economy grows rapidly, and you get some inflation. Let's say it gets to 2.5% or something. At that point, I don't think anybody's going to be disappointed. And the Fed has plenty of room, because interest rates are at about 0 now, to increase interest rates. And also the Biden administration has the legislative capacity to increase taxes on the wealthy, which they want to do anyway. Now, that might be politically difficult, but you can do that through reconciliation. And I feel the same way about the infrastructure, because I share Summer's concern. I can't imagine that they're not talking to Democrats, Democratic senators and members of the House, and thinking about, look, here's the plan. We're going to kind of go at this with this bill, and then we're going to have an infrastructure bill later on. I imagine they're already trying to formulate some kind of a legislative plan to get both of those things done. And I think passing infrastructure, that also tends to be very popular.
I agree. I think, yes, I agree with that. But look, if I were a Democrat, I would vote for this. So just politically, this thing is basically a winner, right? When you look at the polling, people are pretty favorable to it. You even got some Republicans in the House who didn't want any adjustment to the checks, for example. The representative from West Virginia, for example, and the governor for West Virginia is basically saying, go big.
And just to be clear on the polling, so the Quinnipiac poll that came out showed overall 68% support for the stimulus bill, including 37% support from Republicans, and then even more support at 78% for the checks. So the checks are the most even though they're the most criticized, they're also the most popular component of the stimulus.
You can understand why they're popular. People like to get $1,400 checks, obviously. And it's
get some Biden bucks.
Right. And as it's set up, it's pretty simple. It's like, okay, you get a $1,400 check. But I worry, the potential worry is that you get a little bit of a signal that the economy is starting to heat up. And I think we can obviously deal with that, because we've been talking about very low inflation and very low interest rates for a long time now. But I'm worried that will feed into a potential narrative that can be used against other spending proposals. And why waste it on this if you can go 900 billion, 950 billion? And if you could get some Republicans on board, I actually think that would be the better thing to do. I'm not really if you look at the situation and you compare the economic situation now to 2008, 2009, they're completely different worlds, right? 2008, 2009, you had like what, 10.6% unemployment. You were still massively losing jobs. You had a clear aggregate demand problem.
Yeah.
The
So
economy looks a lot different now. And the thing is, the projections of recovery, even if you do nothing, are pretty favorable, right? So
yes,
I
and
would just assume go 900 billion if you could get Republicans on board with that and save some of your political capital for real infrastructure spending.
yeah, and related to that, it's interesting if you look at, again, break the unemployment rate down by sector and industry. One of the sectors that's been hit the hardest, absolutely just awful year, is mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction. So the unemployment rate there last year in January was 1.9%. Right now it's 14.2%. And the Wall Street Journal had a really good article going over oil's awful year. But the Biden administration is signaling quite clearly that they're going to make it pretty hard for the extractive industries
Yes.
for the indefinite future. So I share those concerns.
That's the problem, by the way, with like the limits of left-wing populism, because you run into environmental activism. And so they end up being hostile to extractive industries.
Right. And the other, so you can see the kind of who has power in the Democratic coalition, not the extractive industries, but teachers. Yes. So
Yes.
we'll give a lot of money to the schools. And I think
also notice the checks help educate, like teachers benefit, like that part of the Democratic coalition benefits from those checks.
That's right. And I think there's a good argument that a lot of what they're going to do to like retrofit the schools and what this money will accomplish, none of it's long-term investment. Like this isn't something that you would need to do sans the pandemic, right? So going forward, you're not going to get a lot of return on that. It's just basically 170 billion to try to get people into the classroom. When I think that you could spend less on education and push the unions harder to get teachers back in the classroom, or do kind of innovative but relatively inexpensive things like they're doing in Massachusetts to get the teachers in the classroom and make them feel safe. So I agree. It's frustrating that it's not calibrated well, I think, in many ways to address the current situation. But I think that
one might say that it's calibrated well to benefit the base of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there are. I think the 35 billion for rental assistance. Seems.
Yeah, I agree. There are things in here that I think everyone agrees, or most people agree, should be in there and that are needed and important. I think some of the padding here that's unfortunate is more of like a party taking care of its base.
What I don't understand here either is why wouldn't you be at this time when you have all of these people who are laid off in the extractive industries, why wouldn't you be going hard right now to help those people out and make it easier? Like throw a few symbolic gestures, don't cancel the Keystone Pipeline. Say, we want people to be employed right now. This is more important for the next few years than climate change.
Right. And if you just politically, we want you in our coalition, some of these people, and it seems like an easy get for some of them.
That's frustrating.
It shows you though that that environmentalist intellectual wing has a lot of power. Yeah, it wields a lot of symbolic. It wants these symbolic things.
That's right. And I mean, I think we both agree that in the long run, the extractive industries they're not the future of the economy, but
clearly, yeah.
But for the short and medium term, and especially if you're working with these companies to reduce their carbon footprints, it just doesn't make any
slow
sense
transition
to me.
is good,
Yeah.
especially over
symbolic
concerns.
Spending money on highly educated, decently paid white collar and professional workers at this moment.
Right.
I agree that that's a bad idea. I also agree with McCardle that why wouldn't we try in this bill to really target leisure and hospitality and essential workers to the best of our ability? Now, I know the counter to that is, well, we don't have the data to target this very well, so just take the shotgun out and shoot it, right?
Right. The problem with the shotgun, of course, is a lot of the lead is wasted because it just misses the target. So
that's right. And I also I'll, I guess, iterate what we've said, but I agree with economists, center-left economists like Summers and Barry Eichengreen, who really want to go hard on the infrastructure, and have emphasized that it's just not a great idea to give a bunch of money to people who are going to put it in their bank account.
Right, exactly. Like it seems to me that building things that, I mean, it turns out it's an investment in your economy. Not only does it put people to work, it also invests in your economy by creating infrastructure that helps efficiency.
Yeah,
that's what I would like to see more of. And
I think I'm changed my mind a bit on this, where I can see the wisdom of buying some goodwill from the Republicans, directly targeting this at people who have been affected negatively by the pandemic, and then you do the Build Back Better infrastructure, and you go hard on that because you've already built up this goodwill.
Right, I agree. And also that's going to be really popular. So why use any political, because right now, like, Republicans, I mean, I think the political calculus here very much favors Biden right now, of course. But if you start to see any signs of a heating economy, you're going to get Republicans who are going to point to that in an attempt to swat down future Biden proposals.
Well, more importantly,
give him wins.
Right. More importantly, you're going to get relatively conservative Democrats, such as Manchin, Sinema, Tester, Warner, and Kelly, who will say, we just spent 1.9 trillion. I'm not spending another trillion on infrastructure when inflation is increasing. Interest rates are going up. There's a lot of uncertainty.
I mean, it seems to me, I haven't seen many estimates that suggested that you would be undershooting if you did, say, 800 billion. So, the first proposal was 618. I think you could get that up. So let's say you got it to 800 billion. I just haven't seen many estimates that suggest that's undershooting it.
Yeah, and I think
if it is undershooting, you can always do something else. You can do another round.
Right. And so it seems to me that a good kind of bipartisan solution here, and I don't think that being bipartisan is that important if you have important goals that you want to accomplish. But here, I think if you scaled back the direct payments, scaled back a little bit, but keep in some money for state and local governments because they're going to need it, dramatically scale back the amount that you're spending on school reopening.
Yes.
And maybe split the difference on unemployment insurance.
I
think you'd have a bill that you could get reasonable buy-in and build up some goodwill. And Biden's already acknowledged that you're probably not going to do the minimum wage anyway.
Right.
I mean, that would be one, if you were going to get that might be a reason to go through reconciliation and just call it good. But you're not even getting that.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, I think if I were a Republican operative, I would be happy that Biden's flipping the bird.
Yeah, I'm
If
not.
they end up doing this, I would probably be happy about that.
I'm
Although
not sure.
that's hard. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty popular.
that's true. It is pretty popular. I guess the better question then is just, so the political calculus is, it's hard to say in the long run what the better strategy is, but I think what you try to do then is what's better for the country. And I think going about 800 billion, making better targeting, as you said, splitting the difference on the unemployment, let's say, and some of these other things makes more sense. It would be
Yes.
more prudential, and then it would, I'm hopeful that it would leave open more space for a bold infrastructure
Yeah,
project plan.
right. The Build Back Better is, I think, the type of legislation that Biden wants to be known for, as this kind
Right.
of FDR figure who's meeting the moment by building back the country.
Right.
And again, infrastructure, it's a winner. It makes the economy more productive. Senators and representatives like it when you spend money on infrastructure in their states and districts.
Yes, a disciplined Trump would have done this first.
Yeah,
and he would have reaped the political benefits for it.
That's right.
But yeah.
So overall, I mean, just on the process concern, then we've noted this, but Yuval Levin at National Review Online, he really laments that the Democrats have decided to basically eschew good faith negotiation and just go right through the reconciliation process. I don't share that concern necessarily. My concern is more just why waste a bullet of, you've got 2 reconciliation bills that you can do this year. Why waste one of those on this bill if you don't have to?
Yeah, that's my view. Is I mean, I think bipartisanship is good. It's not great. That is to say, it's a good. If you can get it, that's something you should strive for. But it's not so important that you should squander a good policy because of it. But here, I don't think you are squandering a good policy. In fact, I think it's the prudential thing. I think there are now, of course, look, there are center left economists who also think you should go 1.9 here, but there are also center left economists who have worries about it, and there are center right economists who have a lot of worries about it. I would say be prudential about it, meet somewhere in the middle, and see if you can get 10 senators from the Republican side on board. Look as though, and promote the fact that you're negotiating in good faith with Republicans. Try to create that sense of comity.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we'll see what happens with the stimulus, but it does look like we're on a path to pass close to 1.9 trillion.
Yes,
and we'll see what happens.
Without the minimum wage, probably.
Right. And I think not having the minimum wage in there is going to be deeply upsetting to the left wing of the progressive wing of the Democratic caucus. I think Sanders and Warren and AOC and others will be disappointed.
Yes, I think
Biden said he's still going to fight for it. But if you can't get minimum wage through reconciliation, it's not going to happen.
Biden's not really going to fight for it if he said he doesn't think they can do it, because if he really were going to fight for it, he would not have said that in an interview.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right. That's basically a signal that probably the minimum wage hike is not going to be in there.
Yep, agreed. So we move on to the continuing battle for the heart and soul of the Republican Party. This week we had Liz Cheney surviving her censure vote to strip her of her leadership.
It wasn't really a censure vote, was it? It was a stripping her of her leadership.
Yes, a figurative censure.
Yeah, so listeners will remember that Liz Cheney was one of 10 members of the House who voted for impeachment. Now, she's the number 3 in power, so it's somewhat more significant that she did.
Yes.
She's also from a very conservative district in Wyoming, unlike some of the other...
Unlike the liberal districts in Wyoming.
Yeah, exactly, right. But unlike some of the other people, Adam Kinzinger, for example, who voted for impeachment. Furthermore, she came out with an absolutely blistering statement against Trump that Democrats have quoted to make their case. So she was a target for the Trumpy part of the base, part of the Congress, and of course the base. So for example, Matt Gaetz, who's a famously Trumpy figure from Florida, was very hostile to her, and in fact flew to Wyoming to campaign against her in a kind of stunt.
And going after Cheney, to me, it is an example of performative right-wing populism at its worst. Because if you care about the substance,
right,
she was as reliable of a Trump voter as you would get. I think her Trump score at 538 was quite high. She voted with him like 93% of the time.
So I think that's the thing that's important to know about this, the Civil War and the GOP, is most of it just ends up being about symbolic issues, right? Because while it's true that there's this, I would call it this kind of growing populist / ethno-culturally conservative section of the Republican Party, as a matter of actual fact, they really, the debates that are happening aren't about policies. They're about symbolic displays of fealty to Donald Trump, and that's what's so disappointing about this. So Liz Cheney, she even was I think she supported Trump on most of the immigration proposals.
Yes,
and
she was against the first impeachment.
Exactly. So this is about symbolic fealty to the King Trump, and that's what makes this disappointing, and it's why it's so ruinous to the GOP. There's no point for this. It's just creates hard, bitter feelings in the party and among voters, which you can see in Georgia. You lost 2 Senate seats that you likely could have won if you didn't have these problems. Now, Cheney survived quite robustly. So the vote was like about 70% in Cheney's favor. So
I think, also, I think some of it, so you noted that a lot of it's just symbolic and has to do with fealty to King Trump. I think there's this kind of larger issue that's kind of happening, and you have, so on the substance, the way that these representatives or senators vote, you can't, if you looked at them, you wouldn't know who's supporting Trump rhetorically and who's not. But I do think that there are a lot of Republican voters who feel like they just constantly lose, especially on these important issues that have to do with the American way of life. Like they're constantly taking losses. And what they want to see is somebody who will stand up on some of these issues and just fucking shove it in the ass of Democrats. And they view Cheney in this situation as capitulating to that.
That's even a very graphic and lurid way of putting it. But
there's a lot of animosity out there.
Yes, but I mean, I think it's important to know that and we'll talk about Ben Sasse in a moment, but it's important to know it's not as if Ben Sasse voted against some important immigration bill that Donald Trump forwarded, or that.
I agree.
Right. So the voters, I think, are being distracted by this symbolic veneer. There's
by the behavior and the rhetoric.
Right, exactly. By the symbolism, the pageantry of the populism is a distraction Because if we actually had policies on the ground that were attempting to preserve our ethnocultural heritage, and Liz Cheney was voting against it, and Ben Sasse was voting against it, and Mitt Romney was voting against it, I would be with the people who were opposing them. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is these people are criticizing absolutely repugnant and indefensible behavior from Trump, and the Trumpy symbolists, the Matt Gaetz, the Jim Jordans of the world, are going after them for that.
Yeah. So I think the Levin's distinction between this concern about who's governing and what they're doing,
Yes,
is resonant here.
So the idea is people care about who's ruling and what are they doing. So who's ruling is like, is it somebody like me who's in power? So if you're Black, maybe you want to see Black people in power. If you're a white rural person who's religious, you want white people who are religious in power, who are talking to you, whom you can identify with. Yeah. So you're right. I think, and then what they're doing obviously is, do you agree with the policy? So here it's like Liz Cheney, the idea is Liz Cheney's not one of you.
Yeah, that's right. She's out of touch.
Yeah.
She's not fighting hard enough.
She's a swamp creature.
Right. Like the individuals such as Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or Matt Gaetz, that's who I want to rule because they're fighting for me. That's the kind of person.
They're like me. They turn on Jerry Springer and they like it, and they're not condescending to me. They're not. I mean, also, I think with Liz Cheney, you have the fact that she's Dick Cheney's daughter and that she's associated with. It's easy to associate her with like the worst behavior of neoconservatives and the worst failures of neoconservatism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so where do you see this?
By the way, so anyway, Liz Cheney survives.
Yes.
Then what happens is the Democrats go to Leader McCarthy and House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and basically say to him, strip Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committees.
Yes.
They say they're going to vote about it themselves anyway, which they have the power to do because they're the majority in the House.
And then Gaetz offers a compromise. How about I take her off of her committee?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
McCarthy offers
to take her off education and leave her on like one or
budget.
Two. Yeah. But I think one of the problems here, so in this case, the Republicans rejected it, and it was almost a completely partisan vote to kick
11 Republicans voted with the Democrats to remove Marjorie Taylor Greene from the two committees that she serves on, education and budget.
Yes. And here you can see this as maybe a slight victory for the MTGs, the Trumpy members of the House, of the Congress in general, because the Republicans wouldn't kick her off. Now, I think part of the problem is McCarthy didn't want to appear as though he was capitulating to Democratic pressure.
Yes.
So that is part of the calculus. Now, she should have been stripped of her committees just as a matter of principle, I think. I'm not sure that I like it how it went down, though, because I think it actually raises her public profile. It makes her look more like a martyr, and it ended up just rallying Republicans in the House behind her.
Yeah, there's no doubt that it raises her profile. She's going to get more attention in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
She'll use this on Twitter and other social media. And then it turns it into a completely partisan affair where you have the majority party in the House voting to strip a member of the minority party of her committees.
Right.
And if you flip this around and you think, well, what happens when the Republicans gain the majority in the House?
Right.
I don't like where that path leads.
Right, because they strip Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and some of the radicals in the Democratic Party.
That's right.
I don't like that either. Obviously, I don't like Taylor Greene, and I think Republicans should have stripped her themselves, but
Yes.
I don't like doing it this way. And then we can talk about the overall Civil War. Another battle in the Civil War was when the state Republican Party in Nebraska came out with these papers of censure for Ben Sasse, prominent senator from Nebraska.
And to be clear, that's following other state Republican parties who have censored politicians representing their states who, again, went against dear leader Trump.
Yeah, exactly. So Sasse didn't take this lying down. He came out with a video that was about 5 minutes that was something of an attack on the Republican Party of Nebraska.
Yep.
And he basically said, you are the ones who have changed. I haven't. I'm still one of the most conservative senators. I vote consistently conservative. And politics is not, as he said, about the weird worship of one dude.
Yep.
Obviously referring to Trump. And this was a very popular video. A lot of people shared it, especially a lot of people who are in the Republican coalition, but dislike the Trumpy wing, right? I think they were very inspired by this, you could say. And clearly, I think two things with Sasse. One, he just isn't Trumpy by character disposition. He's like the opposite of Trump. He's a person who really believes in cordial disagreement and debate, trying to come together where you can, and making politics more about gratitude and hope than bitterness and aggrievement. So he just doesn't.
And if you watch Sasse, he looks like the type of dude who would be at the little league ballpark with his kiddies, and he would get along with everybody. Right? He's very much got the dad kind of vibe going on.
Yeah, community leader Sasse, who's like at the making lemonade for everybody's kids at the little league game. Also, I think there's a calculation here, though, which is if the Trump fever breaks, he will be in a very good position in 2024.
Yes.
And so that's certainly, I don't know how, it's hard to, obviously, motivation's difficult to, difficult to adjudicate somebody's motivation and apportion percentages to various impulses. But that is definitely true that if the Trump fever breaks, he may be well positioned in 2023 to run through a primary, because he's, other than Mitt Romney, he's probably been the most critical member of the Senate of Trump and Trumpism.
Yeah, and if I had to guess, I actually think it will break.
Well, that's the question we can get to. So those that's the basic civil war for the week in the GOP. So then, broader perspective here on the Civil War GOP. Who's going to win? What's going to happen? How is it going to happen? Obviously, prognostication is a good way to make yourself look stupid, but it's also fun. So the prognostication, you can go ahead.
My prognostication is that the fever will, this kind of paroxysm after the election and Trump's loss will break. I mean, it's this populist energy on the right is not going anywhere. But I think the more extreme Trumpy version of it will dissipate somewhat. It's not going to completely disappear, because there are a lot of people who really love Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have more institutionalist Republicans such as Sasse and Romney and others thinking very carefully about policies and actually going about day-to-day governance, I think people will see this is the way that we get shit done.
Mm-hmm.
And there's MTG and Lauren Boebert, but there's also Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib in the Democratic Party.
Right.
But by the way, there aren't a lot of soul-searching New York Times articles about
the radicalism of these people, which is, it's like the very irritating thing about populism on the right. And so I will say later, I'm a ethnocultural preservationist. That's the term I like. I have some overlap of concerns with populists, but I think populism tends to be very anti-elitist.
Yes.
And anti sort of mainstream institutions. But one of the problems and one of the things that feeds into this Trump part of this Trump coalition in the Civil War is precisely the fact that these mainstream institutions have been captured by progressives, and they are so obviously biased toward the left that people who are center right or, you know, further to the right get pissed off by them and just want to flip them the bird and want somebody who's willing to flip them the bird, right?
Yes.
And that's annoying. And the differential coverage of radicals in both sides is just one example of many.
Right. So my hope, maybe this is less a prognostication and more just my values and desires, but my hope is that some of the rhetoric of the performative populists will be actually that more institutionalists will thoughtfully adjust their views based on what are legitimate attacks from the performative populists, set the more irresponsible rhetoric and culture warring and identity stuff to the side, and come up with ideas for how to deal with very real problems such as, you know, trade and immigration, globalization, the capture of mainstream institutions by progressives, the leftward tilt or drift of the culture. And I think we're seeing some of that with Mitt Romney's proposal for this child allowance. We don't need to get into the weeds, but it's at least a rethink of the Reagan orthodoxy from the establishment of the party. And if you can do that and show this is a way forward that will keep most of the base, you'll lose some of the rural white voters, but most of the base comes along, and you can also get voters from the suburbs, then you can marginalize the MTGs and the Boberts and the Gateses and the Cawthorns. They're going to be there, just like the Tlaibs and AOCs are going to be there in the Democratic Party. But I think what we should focus on is marginalizing them and not shining a bright light on them all of the time. Now, that's going to be impossible because the Democratic Party is going to constantly do that, and the mainstream media is going to do that to make the Republican Party look batshit crazy.
That serves their interest, obviously. Now, I would say one of the fundamental problems or causal variables that led to this is that the Republican base is very different from the Republican elite. And the Republican base, a significant proportion of them, not probably the majority, but a good chunk of them, were motivated by ethnocultural concerns and demographic change. And that was a serious issue for a lot of them, and it remains a serious issue. And one of the reasons Trump was popular among the base is because they saw him as somebody who shared their concerns, and he talked very explicitly with, I would say, irresponsible rhetoric about immigrants from Mexico and shutting down all immigration from Islamic countries, right? And these are things that are just signals to people who are ethnocultural traditionalists that he cares about their concerns.
Now, would you put into this ethnocultural traditionalist pot, would you include white evangelicals who are extremely concerned about changing cultural mores and values,
religious values? I think a lot of, by the way, a lot of the white evangelicals also have demographic concerns.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's all tied together, right?
Right.
So there's this large and animated group who feel as though the establishment, the George W. Bushes of the world, have flipped them the bird for a long time and have not addressed their concerns. And Trump at least did rhetorically. Now, he did do a little bit. He did, immigration flows did slow during the Trump era, but he didn't do a lot, and he didn't do anything that's really lasting there, but he had a lot of rhetoric about it, and people were attracted to that. So I think one of the major issues moving forward for a healthy GOP is to get some responsible politicians talking about ethno-cultural concerns. And I don't see anybody doing that yet. And that's depressing to me. So I see your best hope here is probably Tom Cotton. And Tom Cotton has come out forcefully against the Biden immigration bill proposal, the outline of it. But what he says is he makes it all about workers. And this is a canard, I think, that immigration concerns about immigration are really about workers. And it's often framed this way by intelligent people and politicians because they are afraid to say it's about ethnocultural preservation.
The reason they're afraid to say that is because that would be a political non-starter.
I agree with that. Right now, in the current context, making the claim that you want to preserve your ethnocultural heritage would get you ripped up. But I think
it would get you ripped up specifically at the ballot, right? Because
I don't know how much that's true. I mean, it would get you ripped up in the mainstream press for sure.
I don't think
nobody really has.
Suburban Bob and Jill are not going to vote for someone who's talking about ethno-traditional cultural concerns.
I think if you did it responsibly, you may find a large proportion of the base sympathetic to you. But the problem is,
yes, I agree with that.
Well, okay, but I mean, I even mean you might be able, if you, I guess what I'd like to see is more intellectuals defending this. You don't have many. I mean, there's Eric Kaufman, the demographer, who wrote the book White Shift, who's basically one of the few intellectuals who's really talking about this in a mature and responsible way, in my view. But you need more of that, because that's the real concern there. And that's what's going to animate populism for the future, is demographic concerns, ethnocultural concerns.
I don't disagree with that, but I think that is a political absolute loser, except for in some Republican primaries. The problem is if you do talk about these ethno cultural concerns, or what do you call it?
Yeah, ethnocultural concerns.
Okay, so
I call myself, you could call it ethnocultural conservatism or whatever, traditionalism.
So if you go forward with this responsible ethno-traditionalism, and I agree that you can do that, and Eric Kaufman does it.
Right, and by the way, to be clear about what this is, ethnocultural conservatism or preservationism is an attitude toward demographics that is not closed to change at all, but it wants change to be slow, so that the majority group of a country gradually shifts. So Kaufman calls this white shift, right? The predominant white group in the United States, or in Britain, let's say, shifts color slightly as immigrants assimilate in. And then there will always be respected minority groups. You respect the minority groups, Asians, Blacks, etc. And you have to preach tolerance for them, and they can be members of that coalition legitimately. There's no hostility toward them. It's about having slow change, because there are people who are attached, people who are attached to those demographic symbols, including people who are a lot of people who are Hispanic, by the way,
right,
actually did reasonably well, or better than many people expected him to do among Hispanics, especially.
I don't think that's because he's an ethno-traditionalist.
Oh, I definitely think that is.
Oh, I think it has more to do with his kind of bizarre, charismatic machismo that is attractive to especially Hispanic men.
Okay, but that's part of it. But the ethno-traditionalism is like folded in there in this weird, inarticulate way that people obviously grasp, and they sense it and they intuit it.
Okay,
but it's not articulated carefully. But anyway, the point is, like, many groups can identify with this ethnocultural heritage. It's not limited. This is why, like, I disdain ethno-nationalism, because it's irresponsible in a diverse country. It's never going to happen, and it's exclusive in a way that is reprehensibly immoral, and it actually detracts from and makes it harder to defend a preservationist perspective.
Right.
Because some people purposefully, but some people legitimately just conflate the two and worry about that. And I think that's understandable, but very unfortunate.
Yeah. So to me, this is something that you can talk about responsibly, that intellectuals can, or academics. It's similar to the bell curve, and that you should be able to have debate about it and be thoughtful. The problem with doing it politically is there is a segment of the white population that is not just ethno-traditionalist or American preservationist. They are outright racist, right? Once you start talking about that, those individuals flow into that coalition rapidly, and they start talking out loud about it. And then that kind of coalition becomes tarred with this like 5-10% or whatever it would be in that coalition that's pretty explicitly racist, anti-institutionalist, and nihilistic about it. And then you lose any chance of getting suburban voters and what so-called quote unquote like decent middle Americans.
That's why I think it's so important to denounce the people who make the coalition look bad and who are just behaving immorally or promoting immoral rhetoric, in my view.
But
it's important to denounce them, but to absorb those concerns into a responsible political movement in the way that Richard Nixon was like the responsible alternative to Wallace, right? And that's important. People criticize Nixon and some of the other Republicans for using the Southern strategy, and there's plenty of debate in the literature about how much they actually did a Southern strategy and what that constituted. But it's definitely the case that Nixon and Reagan absorbed a lot of those what could have been more pernicious attitudes into a benign coalition. And that's what I want to do. I think that's the important task. And so,
but neither Nixon nor Reagan used ethno-traditionalist rhetoric.
No, I agree with that.
And somebody who ran against them would take that segment of the coalition with them.
I agree that they would. So the thing that you have to be, so first of all, I mean, Nixon's America, even Reagan's America, was much whiter than modern America, right?
Correct.
I mean, the number of immigrants who have come in since Reagan is very high, many, many millions, right? So the ethno-traditionalist concerns would have been different and probably would have been more racist against Blacks who were already here, right? I mean, what are you that would just be like a segregationist posture, right? That's what Wallace was doing. Ethno-preservationism is just about slowing immigration down so that you can assimilate a lot of not all of the people who are here, because they don't all want to become members of the dominant ethnicity, but a lot of them do. And there's a lot of intermixing between Asians and whites, Hispanics and whites, Blacks and whites. And what that does is it slowly shifts the dominant population. And I think every country, to my knowledge, that has had a healthy history has been predominated by one group that's sort of seen as the ethno-traditional heritage of that country. Again, you can do this while still respecting diversity.
I agree.
One way of promoting that, Kaufman argues, and I find his argument persuasive, is by slowing down the immigration and promoting the white shift.
Okay, so I think that that's true, but I think the problem with the Republican Party is demographics right now are against you, which is why they don't want to expand the vote, right? I mean, they're aware of this, that it's probably at this point. I mean, you could imagine a scenario where actually the Republican Party benefits from an expanded electorate, but as currently constituted, they don't. So why not attempt to achieve some of those goals while eschewing that kind of rhetoric? So you could be
because it's so two things. One, it's such an important fuel for the engine of misguided populism that I would like to absorb some of it and channel it in a more productive and less divisive direction. One. Two, I care about preserving our European heritage. And what I would do is say, yeah, you know what? I want to make the argument to a lot of people, multi-ethnic groups, that they should support this. Okay, right. So I want to persuade them to join the coalition.
What does it mean to preserve our European heritage?
So it means that you preserve classics in the transmission and education in the classics, specifically of Greece and Rome, that we cherish them, and also that we cherish our European history, British history, for example, and then all the way up through, the founders and Abraham Lincoln, and we protect that legacy, that heritage, from progressives who want to set it ablaze, who argue against it, who find it repugnant and white supremacist, and et cetera, et cetera. I think it's important to create a coalition that actively attempts to protect and promote that.
I'm sympathetic and I share some of those goals, but I just don't see going explicitly ethno-traditionalist as a good way to address that practically. I think
so. You think you should just argue in bad faith or deceptively about these immigration issues and just make it about the economy?
Right. So immigration, you do somewhat deceptively if you're a politician. The concerns about the European heritage, I think the way you do that is the more traditional Republican route of it's about protecting Western civilization, which is inclusive and open to everybody. It has nothing to do with ethnicity, even though we could debate whether that's true, but rhetorically.
No, I agree with that. I think you have to make it inclusive in a country that's as diverse as ours. Right?
And I think you have to make.
What I want to see is a more interbreeding. I would promote.
Well, that's going to happen. I agree.
I agree, and the best way to make that happen is to slow down immigration, because when you have higher amounts of immigration, you get more immigrant enclaves and less assimilation, right? Because it makes sense. You find people who are ethnically the same as you, and for various reasons, evolutionarily and also sociocultural, people have a slight ethnic affinity. That is, other things equal, they'll feel a little bit more trust and attachment to people of their own ethnic group, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I'm saying, if you look at this as, obviously it's important to get elected. So we look at the electoral strategy here. You have high negative polarization.
Yeah, you do.
So that means basically, if you're the Republican candidate, you're not going to get Democrats on board. So you're competing over an ever decreasing pool of independents, and to have your coalition turn out for you. And I think the best way to do that is not to go American preservationist, where you're going to turn off a lot of independents, and you might even alienate some of your own base to get the more preservationist or ethno-traditionalist types.
Well, that might be right now. So what I would like to see is an intellectual infrastructure that defends these ideas responsibly. I would like to see Michael Brendan Doherty from the National Review, who's the closest to this view, just be explicit about defending this without making it about I think these people would sympathize with this view. These people who have respect for Irish culture and they want to preserve that. There are many intellectual ethnoculturalists who I think they don't even know exactly that they are, because they don't like ethno-nationalism. And I don't think they should. I think they're right to find that a little bit repellent. So they find Jared Taylor maybe they listen to him once in a while in private, but they would never admit it in public. And they're like, he goes way too far. He's off-putting. The rhetoric is dangerous. I agree with all of that. That's why I want to make a responsible ethnocultural conservatism or preservationism, where people can just be more open, but very responsible about it and very embracing of the diversity that we have already. You cannot, anytime somebody says something to me about ethno-nationalism, I'm just like, dude, it's a repugnant, immoral non-starter. We have diversity now, and we're not, you can't use rhetoric that would lead to hostility toward those groups. Absolutely not at all.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but that's not a short-term
No, it's not.
Republican
You might be right. So I'm open to, look, if Tom Cotton has to make it's all about economic arguments on immigration, fine. If that's what works right now. On the ground, though, I would like to see more responsible institutions built up that deal with these issues. And the thing that's particularly galling to me is that the mainstream institutions are so hostile to ethnocultural traditionalism that most of the people who agree with this tend to favor populism and a burn it all down attitude instead of like Yuval Levin's argument that we need to build institutions up. That's what I want to do. I want to build up institutions, and you have to fight against the New York Times responsibly and with institutions. You can't do it by being a Substack person. I'm not that there's anything, some people do Substack and it works for them. Matt Iglesias, Andrew Sullivan are great examples. I read them both, but you can't fight the New York Times with a bunch of atomized Substacks, right?
Right.
You have to put together people in a disciplined institution and fight against that. And that's what I want to try to do.
Yeah,
you're right. I will just say as a pragmatist, it may not be politically expedient to do that right now. And if that's the case, I'm perfectly open to using a bit of dissembling. I'm not so attached to candor that I would let it interfere with winning elections.
So do you think that in the short, medium term, that the Trumpy wing of the Republican Party is going to take the party over? Or do you think that they'll be increasingly marginalized as some of the steam is released from this valve that's...
Right. I think the ethnocultural concerns are going to be there. And
Right.
I think they will turn to people like Tom Cotton, who's been a champion of the sort of populist wing without being irresponsible, and who came out forcefully against Biden's immigration proposal. And I think if the Democrats turn to the immigration bill, then you will see who's going to step up and be the leader of that coalition. And that would be interesting to see. What will people like Romney and Sass do during the immigration fight?
I really fear unleashing the furies of ethno kind of populism, like explicitly allowing that to be open in a multiracial democracy such as ours.
I think that that's a fair concern, but I would say
that's why I prefer Sass or Mittens.
I prefer Sass and Mittens because I prefer their character and I care about character. And
I mean, people
are decent, but look, a lot of people who vote for Sass do so because he thinks they will help with ethnocultural preservation. Not that he explicitly says so, but because they want him to. Another thing, so two things on that. I do agree the concerns are legitimate, but that's already there, and it's more irresponsible if you don't sublimate it into a coalition or an institutional structure that deals with it responsibly. One, two, the left is fucking nuts on these issues. On the other side,
they are. I agree.
They're going crazy and running off and picking people off in the culture war that they're dominating. So you need some sort of institution to fight against that.
I agree with that. I think the best way to fight against that both morally and practically, is to emphasize universal values, the values of Western civilization.
I agree, but there's nothing about ethnocultural preservationism that cuts against universalism.
Then why add it to this robust defense of?
Because I think you want to defend the sort of European heritage of the West and the United States, and I think that's perfectly reasonable.
What does talking about the European heritage add to a robust defense of Western civilization and liberal principles?
It's honest. I don't know. I mean, there are people who are attached to demographic, to the sort of demographics of a country, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So I'm not sure why intellectuals shouldn't talk about that institutionally, honestly.
Well, I'm fine talking about the fact that a lot of people in the United States have those concerns, and that those concerns are legitimate. I don't want them to be an open component of a political party that I identify with, any more than I want wokeism and extreme identity politics to be a part of a political party I identify with.
Yeah, but okay, but
I view them as being very similar.
No, I strongly disagree with that. So I think the equivalent of responsible ethnocultural preservationism would be a kind of concern about systemic racism and sexism that's very open to having honest debates about it and very open to different causal hypotheses. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with a left that is concerned with certain minority groups and is willing to have a discussion and a debate about it. My problem with wokeism is that it's illiberal and that it becomes a hateful form of identity politics.
Right, but the reason that we have the debate about, or could have a responsible debate about, systemic racism or policing of Black neighborhoods is precisely on liberal principles of...
Sure, but ethno-traditionalism is liberal. I see no reason that it's not liberal.
I guess I don't see as a political program what it adds to.
It is the program of populists who are disgruntled by mass migration.
I agree with that, but I'd like populists to be
about it.
Right. So I'd like the populist to be defeated, right? And some of the best ideas of populists and of those concerns can be absorbed by the more mainstream of both political parties.
Yeah,
and they can try to instantiate those. Okay, so I don't see then the need to embrace this ethno-traditionalist. I mean, again, as an intellectual pursuit, I think that's fine.
But I just think a lot of people already are doing that, and they just lie about it, or they maybe are confused about their actual concern. So, for example, it strikes me that it's similar to the way that we would criticize, say, the Tea Party. So people had argued, and of course, like the Jonah Goldbergs of the world, wanted the Tea Party to be about this fiscal restraint and fiscal conservatism. But it turns out that when you actually look at it, and people were doing studies at the time, it was much more about karmic justice and about preventing the government from giving handouts to what they considered like leeches, people who weren't putting effort into the system, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I think that it's good to criticize that because it's bad faith and it makes the debate completely confused because people pretend they're debating about one thing when they're debating about another. And it also gives, and here's the thing, it gives people like Iglesias and Klein the high ground. Because Iglesias and Klein, when you debate them on immigration, they will absolutely eviscerate the economic arguments because the economic arguments aren't very good, right? Because it's pretty, I mean, it is true that it has that migration, mass immigration, has some distributional effects, and that it does temporarily hurt low-skilled workers, especially prior immigrants, right? Because they're the ones who are most competing with new immigrants for jobs. But it's also true that overall, it's much better for the economy. And the shock or the cost to the low-skilled workers isn't very high, right? I mean, it's just the evidence is it's not a robust effect there. So you get into a debate with Iglesias, he'll absolutely annihilate you on the economic argument.
Right.
Okay, then you lose. Now,
but you can still have, so there's a distinction with the Tea Party between scholars who are trying to understand it and politicians who are trying to deal with it.
Right.
The scholars who are trying to understand it, most of them are aware of the fact by now that yes, a lot of it had to do with concerns about, So, but political party doesn't have to advertise that, right?
Oh,
and in
fact, I agree, but the intellectuals should deal with the reality.
Yes, they should acknowledge that reality and then try to mold it in a salubrious way.
I agree.
Now, with the immigration, though, I mean, there are two. I mean, you can have two arguments there. One is the concerns about rapid cultural change, independent of race or ethnicity. So, for example, if there were, if you had
but you can't do that, because when you try to do that, people will annihilate you there, because the correlation between ethnicity and culture is so high that they will inevitably bring that up.
Well, I think that if you were in a extremely evangelical state and you had an influx of a lot of Mormons, that would create a lot of problems.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, and then secondly, you can also have a practical argument there if you're a politician. You can say, we're favorable toward immigration and toward giving everybody an opportunity to become an American citizen and get the benefits of an affluent, open society. However, on the ground, it causes a lot of dislocation and backlash.
Yeah, but I find that an underwhelming argument, because
it's accurate.
It's partially accurate, but I think it concedes too much territory. It's basically an unnecessary retreat. I would draw my line further up on principle and argue that there are a lot of people who want to preserve a certain ethnocultural status quo in the country, and that's perfectly reasonable. And that's why we should be cautious about immigration. We don't need to cut it off at all, like completely, but I want to be cautious about it on those grounds. And I want to have that argument and have an argument with Matt Iglesias or Ezra Klein that's honest, so that they don't obliterate me because I'm using sort of, disingenuous arguments.
Yeah, I think politicians can use slightly more disingenuous arguments.
I agree. So it's, political discourse is much more pragmatic, and there's a certain amount of deception that I'm completely willing to tolerate in political discourse that I'm not among intellectuals.
And in fact, not only just tolerate, but is absolutely essential for the functioning of society. That. I don't want a major political figure to have some debate about why African Americans in Chicago commit more homicides, right? They're going to lie about it. And that's fine.
I don't even know if it's like lying. It's just, I don't know that they need to talk about that much, period, because it's unnecessarily divisive.
Right. And I feel this is a similarly divisive issue where politicians should be pragmatic.
I'm open to that. But then what I'm saying is that intellectuals don't necessarily need to be. So, for example, the National Review can run articles on African-American crime and look at it and look at the problems and in a way that I don't know that it would be good for politicians to talk about.
Absolutely. And they could run an article on. The National Review is a lot of what they do is a political program. So they're going to use
absolutely.
the kind of discretion that a peer-reviewed article on crime would not, right? Because
I agree with that clearly, but I think you can have an institution, for example, that's honest about ethnocultural preservationism.
I guess
influences politicians, and they don't necessarily need explicitly to refer to some of those things.
I think the job of politicians is to create a large degree of unity as much as possible. And I think similarly, it would be asinine for Bernie Sanders to go around and talk about why, Christianity is basically like this myth. It's absurd.
I agree.
We should become secular socialists for the betterment of society, and so that we don't have to dissemble about this stupid ideology.
Yeah, I think that the two aren't analogous. But yes, I do agree. I'm saying though, on the institutional intellectual level, I would prefer honesty here, especially because you can't have these debates if you aren't honest about that. It's like having the debate about affirmative action without being honest about like current group differences, whatever the cause is, right? Because you watch these affirmative action debates, and the people who argue against it, in my view, end up looking pretty bad because they refuse to talk about underlying differences.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So if you're going to have that debate, you need to have the debate on honest terms.
Yeah, intellectual hygiene is very important for academic scholars and intellectuals. It's not important for politicians.
Right, I agree.
Yeah.
So it may be that the sort of coalition on the right that is actually ethnocultural conservative or ethnoculturally conservative, they might not explicitly make reference to that, but they will still promote those ideas and defend the policies.
Right. And I'm the first to say that there's a disgusting double standard there, and that the left gets to go all out ethno-progressivism.
Yeah, but right in a way that's maximally divisive. So they can celebrate. They get to celebrate the fact that whites will be a dwindling part of the population.
Yes.
That's something they get to cheer about.
Yes.
But if you say you want to maintain demographic status quo, then that is called racist.
Yes, I agree. There's a intellectual double standard, and it's in academia, and especially bad in the mainstream media. It's a problem, but I think as a political program, that's pretty much a non-starter in the United States. It would not work. It's not going to help the Republican Party down the road.
I disagree with that. I think it very well might. And in fact, if you look at, well, we can transition into.
That's what I was going to say. We can do the Roy and think about how to surmount some of his weaknesses there.
Yes, but just quickly before moving into that, if you look at polling on Biden, it's mostly favorable so far on his EOs. The one place where he may be underwater, especially among independents, is on immigration.
Yeah, agreed.
So there's concern there. Exactly what that wing of the party would look like in rhetoric, I'm not sure, but it's going to be there. There's going to be a part of the party that attends to the interest of ethnocultural preservationists, however that ends up looking.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's end with Avik Roy's article in the National Review magazine. I think it was the January issue, restoring the conservative conscience.
Yes.
So he discusses the triumph of movement conservatism.
Yes.
And to Roy, the apogee of this movement conservatism was the end of the Reagan years.
Actually, it was really the start of the Bush years, right?
Yeah, the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and when the East could move to the West, etc. That end of communism in the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union, is sort of the high peak of movement conservatism. And in fact, according to Roy, it would not have happened were it not for the movement that Buckley started and that culminated, I suppose, in the Reagan-Bush years.
That's right. And so to be clear, movement conservatism is a flavor of conservatism most closely, I think, associated with William F. Buckley Jr. and the National Review, that fused together three distinct segments on the right, or three different kind of coalitions: libertarians, social conservatives, and neoconservatives. The neoconservatives would be maybe somewhat center, even slightly left on some domestic policy issues, but they were very aggressive, hawkish on foreign policy.
Staunch anti-communist.
Yes,
right.
Loathed the Soviet Union and all forms of communism.
Right.
So these distinct kind of coalitions were fused and held together by a hatred of and a fear of communism, especially the Soviet Union, and just a general kind of fear of statism in general. Right. They were all to differing degrees kind of individualists, right? The social conservatives were probably the least individualist, and there was some tension between libertarians and social conservatives.
Right. So you think about what these people are getting out of this alliance. So social conservatives are getting hostility toward secularism and atheism, which is associated with communism. Libertarians are getting the hostility towards statism and anti-market policies. And then, of course, the anti-communist hawks are getting the belligerent foreign policy.
Right. And so Roy, this is the apogee is the fall of the Soviet Union. So the first years of the elder Bush administration. But this movement conservatism did have some weak spots.
According to
Roy. And it's no longer delivering the goods. So his view is that the way we can restore the conscience of conservatism is by returning to these 19th century classical liberal precepts, namely emphasis on equal opportunity, personal freedom, and patriotism.
Yes.
And that these can be the three prongs of this kind of big tent, rejuvenated conservatism.
Right. So we can see he's talking in this very sort of amorphous philosophical bird's eye level with these three things. And it's worth noting, just in the abstract before looking at concrete details, that equality of opportunity and freedom often conflict with each other, which is the problem of speaking so abstractly, is that you have these values that you think you applaud and you think everybody should applaud, but when you actually look at them a little more closely, you realize that they often conflict with each other. So for example, individual freedom says I get to go as far as my talents take me, earn money from that will be different from and probably more than other people, and possibly, and then I can take that money and give it to my children or invest it in my children somehow. Now, obviously, if one child is getting $5 million invested in him or her, and another child is only getting like 40,000, there isn't an equality of opportunity there. That is not equality of opportunity.
Yes. There's also some friction between personal freedom and patriotism, right? Patriotism.
Yes, patriotism.
You submit somewhat to the collective. You have to pay taxes. Salute the flag, etc. Personal freedom says, hey, look, like if I care more about Canada than the United States, fuck it, that's my right.
Yeah, like actually they're very much in tension, because patriotism is about suppressing and submerging individuality into the coalition.
Right.
That's
just
the point of it.
Institutions in general, right?
Yes.
Whatever else we could say about them, they constrain individual freedom.
Right.
So
the concepts are very abstract here, but he does go over some specific things. So he says basically that movement conservatism's real blind spot was the equality of opportunity, right? That they were largely opposed to the Civil Rights Bill of 64, and that they maybe haven't supported equality of opportunity as much as they should have or should.
Yeah.
And he therefore proposes, what are the concrete proposals here?
So he says that these new conservatives should be for civil rights. Nobody's going to disagree with that. We
went past that one, so yes.
Yeah. They should stand united against cancel culture.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
And that's like a hard one, because it's not clear what cancel culture is. Everybody's for stigmatizing certain kinds of speech, so it's not clear exactly what that means.
Yeah, it gives us no direct guidance for how to deal with social media platforms or these real challenging issues of our time.
Right. Is it if you support kicking Trump off of Twitter? Not saying that I do, but if you do, is that supporting cancel culture?
Is it supporting?
Say yes. I don't know.
Is it cancel culture to strip MTG of her committee spots?
Right. Or is it cancel culture to try to censure Ben Sass for criticizing Trump? It's like, it's not clear, and that's why these vague. I think vague principles are okay, but you can see that when you get into the details, you run into a lot of problems pretty quickly. So,
right.
okay.
So also
cancel culture,
we should be for YIMBYism, that is, build more housing, make housing more affordable, especially in coastal areas. Again, whatever.
Areas dominated by Democrats where you're not going to win elections as a Republican anyway.
Yeah, the YIMBYism is already something that red states take a great deal of pride in, such as Texas and low cost of living southern states. So yeah, whatever. Also, we should be for free enterprise. I don't know really any mainstream political figure who's advocating that we dispatch the market system.
Right. So, you could argue like there's a continuum from like libertarian to socialist or something in mainstream discourse. And what Roy is saying is we should be closer to the libertarian side, although he doesn't really specify that.
No, so he has this concrete example of where we should support free enterprise, and that he brings up education. So the cost of college education has dramatically increased. And Roy notes that some people on the left say that this is due to market fundamentalism, but actually it's due to government regulations and cronyism.
Right.
I think the problem with that is, one, I don't really know anybody on the left who thinks it's because of market fundamentalism.
Yeah, I
like any serious thinker on the left. And two, most of the runaway cost of both healthcare and college education has to do with Baumol's cost disease, right?
And explain Baumol's cost disease.
So basically the idea that in these sectors of the economy where labor is really important, and you can't, like, for example, a professor, you have a class of 17 people. That's the same number of people you taught in 1960.
Right.
So as the economy overall becomes much more productive, people have a higher standard of living. The professor wants and desires a higher standard of living, but you're only teaching the same number of people. Therefore, it becomes more expensive to those individuals.
Yeah. So in other words, you can't increase really the efficiency of education in some sense. So it's like, how do you increase the efficiency of a quartet? You can't. You need four players to play, right? So
that's right.
I mean, libertarians have fantasized about all of these unique ways of doing education Right. And what I think we've seen across the pandemic is how flawed their thinking on these issues has been, because it turns out that there really isn't a great substitute, especially for people with middling and lower IQs, for in-class personal instruction.
That's right. And related, this isn't Baumol's cost disease per se, but relatedly, one of the other things that leads to high educational costs is that 20-year-olds demand better living environments than they did in 1970. So colleges have to provide nicer dorms, better facilities, like the rec centers, better one important area is like their food offerings, right?
Yes. Now, what you would, the libertarian would retort that one of the problems is people aren't actually paying out of pocket because you're getting loans.
You're hiding the cost.
The cost is hidden in the same way that it is in the health market and in healthcare, hospitals, etc. But it's just not clear how you negotiate that thicket.
Yeah, what I would say is, this is the rising cost of education is a very real problem.
Yeah,
but it's extremely complex, and the idea that just having this free enterprise versus cronyism is going to solve the education
it doesn't
issue.
Even get at it, right?
Yeah, so it's mostly a miss there. And then he also says that we should be for or promoting a Hayek-style universal health insurance system, and encouraging more private sector competition.
And so people might recognize Roy as the right-wing sort of healthcare wonk, especially like during the Obamacare debates and then the getting into the repeal Obamacare debates, right?
It's especially well known for getting eviscerated in multiple debates about healthcare by Ezra Klein.
I was just going to say, you may recognize him as being on the losing side of multiple debates with Ezra Klein. And I think the problem here is I give Roy credit for being a civil, decent human who attempts to forward serious policy proposals and debate those policy proposals, as Levin did with Ezra Klein on healthcare too, with serious progressives. The problem, I think, is you get this wonky idea of like this perfect right-wing idea that you could implement with healthcare, but it's totally incongruent with what you have on the ground already.
Correct.
And it ends up actually being anti-conservative in that you would have to like ruin a lot of the infrastructure we already have and go in a direction that no politician is going to anyway to implement it. Yes. And so look, we have the ACA. It's popular now. We're going to tinker with it and improve it. And I just don't see the argument that we should move away from that toward this other proposal that's not going to pass anyway.
Right. So the healthcare system in the United States, it's composed of thousands of kludges.
Yes.
But clearly the trend is toward Medicaid expansion and moving toward a public option and perhaps some form of universal Medicare. We could start by lowering the age of Medicare eligibility, et cetera. But that's what's going to happen on the ground.
Could you imagine a conservative politician saying, hey guys, I'm running on this platform, more free market in education, get rid of ACA and go toward a Hayekian insurance program. and equality of opportunity.
Right.
And that would go nowhere.
I think that kind of nirvana fallacy type thinking with healthcare, where it's, I think that also applies to a lot of the more performative populist actual, like their attitude, or at least rhetoric toward unions. So
Yeah, I
abstract
agree.
support of unions, but
Right.
in the concrete, no, I want to be a right to work state, or no, this union here isn't good because there's going to be some corruption and it's going to have some create some inefficiencies.
The problem is here with Roy is it ends up being the opposite of conservatism. And I guess it's appropriate that he's actually citing 18th and 19th century liberals, right? He's more in the tradition of, say, Thomas Paine than Edmund Burke here, because what you're proposing is actually like a radical adjustment to some of these things instead of tinkering with and making the healthcare better. Making health insurance better through tinkering, which is what the conservative would advocate.
Not only that, but I think there's now good social scientific evidence that one of the problems we face as a society is hyper individualism.
Yes.
There are a lot of benefits to hyper individualism and being able to express yourself and emphasizing autonomy, but there are very real costs, and historically that's what Burkean conservatives were concerned about, is the community, social capital, the sense of solidarity. So why now we're facing a situation where a lot of people are feeling alienated, isolated, individualism's not providing the goods that it maybe did in the 70s and 80s. And Evik Roy's like, let's do more of that individualism.
So think of so the challenges, he doesn't address any of the challenges that actually concern conservative voters, such as
what
declining social capital, right? And like drug overdoses, drug abuse, maybe
sexual mores,
changing sexual mores, maybe abuse of social media, at least in the sense that it's taking away from investment in social capital, immigration, etc. It's just like doesn't address any of these things, and you can kind of see there is this faction. Charles Cook would be in it, Jonah Goldberg, David French, this much more classically liberal, veering toward libertarian, but not quite libertarian faction of the sort of conservative movement that I view as just totally out of touch with the real problems that we face, and proposing these solutions that people were proposing in 1982. And just very baffling to me. And the more I think about this Roy piece, the more perplexed I am and almost vexed by it. It's just like such a, here's the way moving forward. Ignore all of the problems that have caused this populist rage and move back to 19th century liberalism. No, thank you, Roy. I will not be on that bus.
Right. So I think if we thought of you and I, if we think about what issues do we think are most pressing, I would say economic inequality, the dignity of work, which would involve dealing with trade, automation, globalization, immigration, declining social capital, perhaps decline in civic society, dealing with rapid cultural change, including changing mores about sexuality in the family. Whatever our view on that, it's a problem that needs to be addressed.
And changing sex roles.
Yes, right. So these are the very real issues that voters have made it clear that they're really concerned about, right? So on the left, there's a lot of concern about racial justice, but there's also a lot of concern about economic inequality and how do we provide meaningful work for people who do not have advanced degrees. Roy, all of these concerns are very real. We should think very carefully about a conservatism that addresses them. Roy just says, fuck all of that.
Yeah, I'm
going to double down on Reaganism.
Right. I mean, to me, what you have is an overabundance of individual autonomy and freedom. And what
I agree completely
is create narratives that persuade people to give up a little bit of that for the greater good of communities and institutions.
Right. And by the way, these problems that we identified here, those are problems that social scientists, both liberals and conservatives, have identified through a lot of rigorous research. It's not like just my pet project. It's like, no, Charles Murray, Robert Putnam.
Roy does cite Charles Murray's Coming Apart,
Right,
right?
he does.
But then he offers nothing to solve, in the same way that he cites the concerns of preservationists, but then offers literally nothing on immigration. So if you're a classical liberal, what's your view on immigration? Is it more open borders? That would seem to maximize freedom.
That seems to be the direction that
is that pro-transgendered ideology? Because you would think it would be, if that's what a person wants, that would be maximizing autonomy. I don't know. It's such a baffling proposal in my view. It's going to go nowhere, thankfully. It's just not obviously like the direction of conservatism. It's just totally baffling to me. I don't even understand. It's if I were favorable to classical liberalism, and I am a liberal, small L, although I'm much more conservative than some small L liberals. If I were sympathetic with that, though, I would try to propose policies through that sort of ideological prism that would solve some of these problems on the ground, the way, say, Ben Sass does, right?
And that's why I think something that Yuval Levin discussed in his interview with Ezra Klein is important, is that we need to carefully think about and formulate a vocabulary to address these concerns, like the concerns of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to do that by taking 19th century buzzwords and updating them.
That's why I've been talking about ethnocultural preservationism. That's one.
But that's just a non-starter.
No, it's not a non-starter. It's that you're captured and you're unimaginatively stuck to the previous paradigm, and you're not looking ahead to the new paradigm of language. Ethnocultural preservationism will be a part of, and we will have a better language for dealing with some of these issues. And instead of focusing, say, obsessively on GDP, we'll think about, how does this policy increase social capital? Right?
I agree.
Why wouldn't we think about that? When we run something, we have a congressional budget office. Why don't we have something where we think about, would this increase or decrease social capital? When you make Twitter more addictive, when you allow people to scroll through it endlessly, and it's just filled with these tweets that are moral outrage, that people get this shot of adrenaline from, is that good or bad for the community? These are things we should be asking and thinking about, right?
Yeah. Yes, I agree. So I think having debates about, trying to come up with a kind of argo that is up to the task of dealing with these issues is important. I agree with you that perhaps you could do so for ethno-traditionalism in a responsible way. We don't have that vocabulary now.
Yeah, we definitely don't.
Also thinking about like why not, with the Biden administration, go big on this infrastructure and build bike trails in communities, build civic centers. Like,
they should.
My favorite example of this in Mitchell, South Dakota. Nobody would know this place because it's Mitchell, South Dakota, but there's this civic center. It's the Corn Palace, like the gaudiest building in the world. I recommend everybody Google it. It's hilarious looking, but it's great. It gives this little town in nowhere, South Dakota, this kind of building that they have pride in. People don't take it that seriously. You get pictures in front of this gaudy Corn Palace building, but why not go for that? Something that will help build social capital on the micro scale, and we can kind of scale that up.
And so again, I would just I agree with that, and I would say I'm just in the camp that's sort of the opposite of Roy. So again, I think we need to persuade people to sacrifice some freedom. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about is we need to start treating social media as though it's a drug. Now, what do I mean by that? Drugs are, you hear drugs and you think bad, or if you're young, you think awesome. The truth is they're neither good nor bad. They are useful and they can be fun, but they can also be incredibly destructive. Right. So like if you drink once a week or something, or you have a drink a day or whatever, it's probably just enhances your life, and that's fine. In the same way that if you log on Facebook once a day for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, it's probably good for you, or it can be. Same thing with Twitter. Problem is, it's easy to abuse, and they design it so that you will abuse it. It's designed the way that a cigarette is designed, to give you a sharp boost of some kind of internal drug that makes you feel good or outraged or whatever it is that will make you click more, right? That is what Twitter does. They have algorithms designed to show you a world that you want to interact with more. Now, we know from research that people interact more with tweets that are full of moral outrage. If you just look at the words that are used, they're morally valenced words, they get spread more. That's, I don't think, healthy. I think it's what nicotine is. It sort of feels good and it's engaging in the short term, but it's very ruinous in the long term. So we need to study this more, and we need to start treating it the way we treat drugs, right? And we need to say, look, it can be good. It can be a good part of your world. But in the same way that we understand that Anheuser-Busch needs to be regulated, and we need to think about warning people about the excesses of alcohol, or whatever we do with it, or with cigarettes, we need to do that to social media. And there are a few, and this is why, as much as Josh Hawley's antics bother me, at least he's coming up with some ideas here. However incipient and inchoate they are, he's putting them out there and thinking about this. And that's, to me, the more exciting part of the right than this let's go back to John Stuart Mill bullshit.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And thinking about an area where I think Republican rhetoric or conservative rhetoric can shift would be going back to Teddy Roosevelt, kind of emphasizing nature and our common land and preservation. That's something where you get a lot of bipartisan support as well, because progressives really like these hiking trails, mountains, taking advantage of that, camping. I think, we need to think of things about thinking about social media, the potential deleterious effects, thinking about our public lands, public goods, public spaces. None of this falls under the movement conservatism or Reaganism or free enterprise. These are just problems that vocabulary doesn't really deal with.
I just see it as such a, it's completely moribund, nearly defunct in my view. And I start thinking about, well, where can you get unique coalitions together to move things forward? Like, you could actually get a lot of allegiance between conservatives and certain kinds of feminists and progressives on like the dangers of certain kinds of obscenity and advertising and pornography, right? Those are things where you have shared interest, even on some trans issues where you have feminists who are worried about what that means for women, right?
Yeah,
you can get some alliance there. And I would keep, and this is why.
Also, just a couple more areas. So on finance, you can get some bipartisan support.
Yes.
The Romney proposal, Democrats were pretty favorable toward it.
Yeah, you can get
on social media and Twitter, you just had Klobuchar sponsoring this bill that would entail Section 230 reform. I haven't looked into it, but that's an area, as you were mentioning, where I think you can get some liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats having some real discussion about that.
Right, and this is where I there's a sort of internal debate that's interesting in the GOP. We've been talking about some of it, but another more responsible, more muffled, not as public part of this is the debate between people such as Sohrab Ahmari and Patrick Deneen and people such as Jonah Goldberg and David French. And one of the things that the Amari camp is more amenable to using government power to guide people toward the good life. And the French Goldberg camp, of course, and Roy would be in this too, they're very reluctant to allow the government to do that. And they always move to blaming parents and families. But the problem is, look, when your 14-year-old has an iPhone and is away from you almost all day, there's nothing realistically you can do about it, in the same way that if you have wide availability of narcotics, you can be the greatest parent in the world. You're not going to prevent your child from getting a hold of them. And guess what? 16-year-olds don't make the greatest decisions in the world. Like we all know this. So I just find that it's just this kind of empty, the government always comes in and fucks everything up ideology.
Yeah, so it's this kind of extreme small L liberalism that says if we maximize freedom, maximize individualism, have limited government, rule of law that's applied equally, property rights that are enforced, and colorblind neutral institutions, all will work out for the best, basically. You can't do better than that. Whereas the kind of post-liberal thinking is maybe that's not actually true. Maybe that worked for a period of time, but we need to rethink that a bit.
And do you think about when did it work? It worked in a different kind of environment. It worked in an environment in which you didn't have, first of all, it actually never worked because the thing is, we always regulated certain things, but we just become blind to regulation because we accept it. We take it for granted. For example,
not only did you only
child work laws, that's an infringement. And in fact, there were a lot of debate about this before it happened. Now we just take it for granted that, of course, if you're 14, you can't work 40 hours a week.
Right. So not only that, but you had a cultural consensus.
Yes.
Right. So, for example, you read about the kind of furor that Psycho caused when it was released.
Right.
Yeah.
Different environment. Like I was just looking, for example, at Brian Warner, better known as Marilyn Manson, who's been in the news because of the accusations of Rachel Evan Wood, among other people. That I'm shocked to hear that he may be an asshole.
It's hard to imagine.
But I was looking at some of his concerts and some of the videos, and it's just this absolutely outrageous, obscene, in my view, just disgraceful bullshit. I mean, just this monstrous behavior that it's like, okay, where do we draw the line on this stuff? How do we allow communities to protect themselves from it if they don't want that? And you can't, I just think it's so facile to talk about parenting. Your kid has an iPhone and can look up Marilyn Manson videos when they're 12, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it as a parent. And
I mean, more problematic to a lot of conservatives or even non-conservatives is that your 12-year-old can go on Pornhub.
Oh, right. I was going to say porn is, I'm just.
I mean, this is just, it's unavoidable. And parents have the armamentarium at their disposal is extremely limited.
Correct. It just is. Yes. So it's and look, like the fact, now we actually understand that the founding fathers, when the First Amendment was not obviously about pornography or any of this stuff, frankly, very obviously. And so I think you could get, like, David French would accept this, like obscenity is in a different category, etc. So to be fair to them, and I understand their vision, it's an appealing vision. And I think it was the right vision in the 1950s when you did have more social capital and a much broader consensus on like social norms, and you could regulate these things via social norms. You didn't need laws because you didn't have to do it that way.
Right. And it provides also superficially satisfying pat solutions to what are extremely complex problems in the same way that economic libertarianism does.
Agreed. So, I mean, I guess to summarize, I found Roy's solution not only baffling, but almost a vexing, a vexing refusal to grapple with the actual challenges of the 21st century and of the thing that the conservative coalition needs to offer to people to create a broader coalition. And it's just a totally uncreative thinking, is remarkably uncreative. And I want to think about how can we make alliances with people who would vote for Ocasio-Cortez where possible, and think about that more. Because you know what? The fact of the matter is, and I guess Roy does say this, but then doesn't really speak to it much, there are a lot of people who are socially conservative in their private lives who are repelled by Republicans. And what we need to do is appeal to their social conservatism in a way that draws them into the coalition.
Yeah, and I agree. And my thought is, I'm not ascribing motives to Roy, nor do I know exactly what discussions led to this article or these ideas, but it seems to me like this is the stereotypical example of the types of ideas that would be dismissed fairly as the thoughts of an out of touch elite in
Yes.
the Republican Party,
Yes.
having other discussions with elites and think tanks and on the Hill, right?
Yes.
Rather than actually taking the concerns of your constituents seriously.
Yes, I also agree with that. It's yeah, it's again,
baffling, quite
I'm
frankly.
really perplexed by it. Yes, I'm perplexed by
Well,
it.
you know, 2024, the winning campaign platform is going to be Hayek and YIMBYism. So
right. Hayek, and making the college education system more free market, I think, will definitely rile up the base.
Yep. So this week we expect to see more debate discussion about the stimulus bill, and we will be back to discuss that and more next week.